We have a talk now called Utility First CSS with Tailwind. It's from Luke Bennett. So Luke is a local to the Port Macquarie area. He's one of the organisers here for WordCamp Port Macquarie, and he also contributes quite a bit to the WordPress Port Macquarie meetup groups, the local meetup groups. So he is a web developer at Phiranno Designs.
Close enough.
Close enough. Okay. So please welcome Luke to the stage.
Hey everyone, it's awesome to be here. So yeah, I'm doing a talk today on Utility First CSS. So first of all, my clicker's not working. Fantastic. All right, cool. This is going to be a relatively technical talk, so I want everyone to enjoy it though. So please ask any questions. If I get too in-depth or nerdy or whatever, just put your hand up or whatever, and I'll try to break down and use plain, simple English the best I can to explain everything. So yeah, I'm Luke Bennett. I'm a front-end developer at a small 3-person digital agency here in Port Macquarie, Phiranno Designs. I'm the developer there, so I do all the web stuff. I don't do a lot of WordPress stuff personally, but hopefully this should be applicable to most of you since it's to do with CSS, which every website uses. Is this clicker going to work? So, show of hands, who likes CSS? Hey, that's awesome. I love CSS. This is really slow. I might just use the keyboard. Who you think CSS is hard? Just Alistair. No. So, the basics of CSS, once you get past the syntax and everything like that, it's pretty easy. Most people should be able to pick it up pretty quickly. You need to learn what the properties do, and it's pretty easy to read. But long-term maintainability and dealing with specificity and the cascade part of things, especially if it's someone else's project or you come in, or it's a large project, it can get really, really difficult to detangle. So hopefully, one of the things that we're going to be showing you with utility CSS is how that'll help fix that. CSS can be hard, but it doesn't have to be. So first of all, just to explain what utility CSS is. Utility CSS is the idea of breaking down your CSS into just really small atomic pieces, the smallest thing it can possibly be. So normally it'll map one-to-one with a single rule. So it means you're using a ton of classes. So it can look a little bit ugly, but I think the benefits outweigh the visual ugliness of it. Sometimes people refer to it as functional or atomic CSS. So if you've ever heard those two terms, it's basically the same thing. And yeah, it maps one-to-one with a CSS rule. Here's some examples. So you might have a class of absolute, which would mean position absolute, block, display block, etc., etc. So what's Tailwind? So Tailwind is a CSS framework that generates utility classes for you. That might be a bit hard to read on the screen, but this is from the State of CSS survey this year, showing you a bunch of different frameworks. So in terms of awareness, Tailwind's right down here because it's fairly new, but if you have a look up here, the interest and the satisfaction are the highest of all the frameworks that were in the mention. The developer satisfaction is really high at 81%. So people who use it love it. So what does it do? Well, it's a framework, but it's also a CSS plugin. You can use it from a CDN. So just throw it up in the head of your document and you're off to the races. You can use all the default classes. But the real value from Tailwind comes from how configurable it is. And to do that, you need to use it as a post-CSS plugin. And so post-CSS, just to give you another example, another word to learn, post-CSS is a framework for plugins which will modify your CSS in different ways. So it'll take CSS, convert it into JavaScript, do some things to it, and then spit it back out. So a popular plugin a lot of you might have heard of is Autoprefixer. So Autoprefixer takes your CSS and generates vendor prefixes so that your CSS that's outputted will have better compatibility with like a wider variety of browsers. So what problems are we using utility CSS to try to solve? First of all, who has wasted way too much time trying to debug CSS problems? Yeah, pretty much all of us. Generally, when you're debugging a CSS, when you have a problem with CSS, it's one of two things. It's either you don't understand what you're doing, you don't know what the properties are, or it's a specificity or cascading problem. So the first one I can't really help you with. You need to sort of spend the time to actually learn how CSS works. You're going to have that problem with any framework or whatever you try to use. But when it comes to using the cascade and specificity problems, Tailwind and utility first approach in general really, really helps, because what it does is it flattens the specificity. There's a bunch of different ways that you can select elements with CSS. So you can use just selecting the element by itself. You can use classes, you can use IDs, you can use attributes. And they all have different values, and you can chain them together on top of that, which multiplies the values in weird ways. It can be really hard to understand, to work out what would win in a specificity war between two things that are trying to style the same element. So basically, before I started using Tailwind, this is kind of what I felt like using my CSS. But now I've got a lot more confidence that what I'm going to do isn't going to break something. Talking about specificity, maybe the slide ones will be a bit easier to read, but this is an example I found on Twitter by Adam Argyle, who is the developer advocate for CSS at Google. And it's just a little quiz, basically a little HTML block here saying an address with two links with a class of link inside of them. And we've got three different CSS rules selecting the same thing. And the question is, which one would win in this situation? And we've got 462 votes, and I deleted all the so you can't actually see who won here, because I wanted to see if any of you guys can work it out. So the first one here is body with an address nested inside the body, selecting an A or an anchor link, and we're going to color it hot pink. The second one is an address with an anchor with a href attribute on it. We're going to color it purple. Or address with a link with an anchor with a link class, and we're going to start at cyan. Does anyone know, confidently, could you tell me which one would win?
I need to see if it's got the one. And then I can do it.
Anyone? Right, yeah. So basically, so the first one, it's got three selectors, but they're all selecting the element themselves, which is the lowest specificity. So each of them would get like a point of 1, so that would be a value of 3. The second one, it gets 1 for the anchor, for the address, sorry, it gets 1 for the anchor, and it gets 10 for the href. And we would get the same value for this one. You get the 1 for the address, 1 for the anchor, and 1 for the class, because an attribute and a link have the same level of specificity. So it's actually a tie. So in this case, it would come down to source order. So because cyan was selected last, cyan wins. So how annoying and complicated is that? I did notice that, yes. I didn't write the tweet, so you can blame Adam Argyle. So nobody gets a YP plushie, sorry. All right, another thing we're trying to deal with is the dreaded append-only style sheet. Has anyone ever had to deal with an append-only style sheet? So that's basically when you come into a project, or you've got a theme that you're using, or whatever the case may be, and it's this massive behemoth, and no one understands how the CSS works. So whenever you go to style something, everyone's terrified that they're going to break something, so what they do is they append something to the end of the style sheet, making the problem worse for the next person. And then they probably throw an important at the end there just to make sure it wins. So, this is a huge problem, and a lot of people have to deal with it. And again, I guess went over it before, but because we only selecting classes, the CSS is so much flatter. And then due to the cascade, if we go to style something that's nested inside, that's only been styled by a class up here, then you're always going to win by whatever you're trying to select. It's just so flat and so easy. So we're basically eliminating the cascade side of things. This I thought was kind of funny. It's kind of a good example of append-only style sheets. Two CSS properties walk into a bar stool and a completely different bar falls over. It's so true. Like you've no idea what effect you're going to have by messing with the CSS that's already there. It's a bit like this. So if you take a component-first approach, you're creating components that might not get reused. So it's adding complexity to your code base, and it's adding bloat. Two things you don't want. It makes it so much harder to maintain when you have those things. So this was a case study by John Polacek, I think his name was, who was working at gesture.com at the time about basically this same situation. He's come into what was essentially an append-only style sheet, and his job was to refactor the code base to make it so that the developers there weren't all terrified to touch the CSS or to only append CSS to the end. So he's looked into it and he decided that he wanted to try a utility-first approach, or as he calls it, Atomic Css. And as you can see, this is the size of the code base over time. It gradually grows during the traditional CSS. He comes on board here, refactors it to an Atomic or utility CSS, and it continues to go down over time because you can be confident to remove the classes that aren't being used due to the flatness and how clear it is when you're writing the markup. Another really good thing about utility CSS frameworks is that you can sort of use them piecemeal. You don't have to go all in 100% if you're not sure about them or you just want to try it out. And this is kind of what I recommend for a lot of people just getting stuck into it. Just change over one component at a time. Maybe you've got your header styled a certain way. You've probably only written the header once, and it gets reused across every page on your website anyway. So just pull all the classes off everything, and then try to recreate it using utility classes, and then you can delete that CSS forever. So again, you don't have this problem anymore where you got to change one thing and the whole thing falls over. Another problem we're trying to solve is naming things. It might sound really dumb, but coming up with names for your classes that make sense is really, really hard. As a wise man once said, there are only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation, naming things, and off-by-one errors. Bit of programming humor there for you. And this is made worse by the conventional wisdom called separation of concerns. So it makes things way harder than they need to be. So just to explain what they are, typically most websites are made with three things: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So HTML you can think of as the noun. It is what the content is. The CSS is the adjective, so it describes the content. And the JavaScript is the verb, describes what the content does. So the separation of concerns is the idea that each one of those things should only do that thing that they're meant to do. So if we're coming up with class names for our HTML, we shouldn't give them names that are describing what they look like. They should describe what they are at more of a semantic level, which can be really hard. So you end up with really generic, weird names like card or header or nav or inner wrapper, or these names that don't really mean a lot by themselves a lot of the time. And the bigger the project is, the more that compounds, because there are a lot of things that might have a name that makes sense to use for both of them. So going over this separation of concerns idea, a really great example of it is this website Css Zen Garden, which was really popular years ago. And it's a really simple idea. You've got a HTML document, and web designers and developers submit their own style sheets, and then they completely reskin the website using only CSS. So the HTML is the same between all those websites. It's just different CSS, and you'd be amazed how different you can make things look. And that's amazing. Like, look how reusable that HTML is. But it's kind of a cool party trick. Like, maybe it's not just because we can do something, maybe it doesn't mean we should. Because we can quite easily end back in the append-only situation with this type of code. the bigger the project gets, or as new people come on board who don't understand how it works, the people who design these are expert developers. You know, they're some of the best in the world. Like, what about us normal people? So, all right, that's really difficult. Let's let some experts help us. Let's use a framework. So there's a ton of CSS frameworks we can use, and you know, there's Foundation, there's Bulma, there's Material UI, but probably the most popular one that most of you would have heard of is Bootstrap. And you can probably all tell just looking at it that it's Bootstrap, even though it doesn't say it anywhere, because all Bootstrap websites look the same. They just do. They're kind of boring. And they were great at the time when they came out. It used to be called Twitter Bootstrap, which is kind of what they used to style Twitter. And they came about at a time when we were using things like floats and tables to style things. So the fact that I had this cool grid system and you can have things stacked together in a row, like how cool is that? And that was really, really hard to do at the time. So everyone used it. But as time's gone on, we've got things like Flexbox and CSS Grid, and we've got these awesome tools that are not that hard to learn once you get the basics down. But people continue to use Bootstrap because it's what they're used to, and you get so much for free. But the downside is that, you know, they all look the same, and especially Bootstrap. It uses important tags everywhere. It's impossible to override anything. It's a nightmare. So we spend all this time trying to undo the stuff. We're spending so much time trying to undo what Bootstrap gives us by default that we may as well just do it ourselves, write the CSS from scratch. So why don't we just do that? Let's write all the CSS. Let's do it all ourselves. And obviously we still have that problem. We've got to come up with the names for everything. So there's a ton of, thankfully, we can consult the experts and we can use a naming methodology. And there's a ton to choose from. There's BEM, object-oriented CSS, there's SMAX, there's IT CSS, there's a million more I couldn't be bothered listing. But probably the most popular one at the moment is called BEM. And BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. And this is an example of what they would be. So the block is the container element, the thing that we're trying to style in general. And then inside the block we have the elements. So, you know, the block, in this case we're styling a navigation. And so the element inside that navigation would probably be a link. So we can't call it just link because that's too generic. So we need to scope that name to the block. So we do that by prefixing the block name to the element with the double hyphen. So we get nav -- link. Make sense? And then we have the modifiers for anything that's styled differently. So if it was a SaaS product, for example, you might have a sign up button in your navigation and you want that one to stand out. It's the call to action. So you signify that it's a modifier with a double underscore, so primary or C2A or whatever makes sense in that case. But we also need to have the nav link by itself on this one. So it inherits all the styles from the nav links, and the primary or the C2A or whatever we're using as the modifier only adds extra styles is to make it stand out from the rest. And generally it'll be further down the cascade, so it will win any specificity wars. Cool. So, and this is just an example of what that might look like in code, if anyone can see that. Don't too worry about the code examples too much if you can't see. But we still kind of have this problem of, what is the block in this case? Like, is it the whole yellow section? Is that the whole block? Because the navigation itself, especially on a bigger website, maybe that's the block. And then we've got the links inside the navigation. Or maybe the sign out button is important enough and it gets reused enough throughout the site that that's the block. So we still kind of got a problem of, like, what are we actually naming things? And yeah, so it's still hard. And generally, using the nav example from here, what is the nav? Is it the nav in the header of the document? Is the nav in the footer of the document? In the sidebar? Is it the table of contents? It could be a million different things, and you probably want to style them all differently. So we can't call it nav. We have to call it nav-header, or, you know. So we've got this problem with names again. We keep coming back to these same problems. So this is an example. We've got this website, and we want to build this card. So we think we want to give it a name that's unique because we don't want to have this naming collision problem. So we're going to call it character card. Make sense? And so this is what the markup might look like. It's an article with character bio with character bio class, and then the image is character bio -- image. The div is character bio -- content, and we've got a title and a copy and so on and so forth. And that's what CSS would be. But say you decide you want to start writing articles on that same website, and you want to have an article preview that looks kind of like that. So now we could write the CSS again, and we could have this one be .article preview, but it looks pretty similar. Like then we're writing the CSS twice, which is not keeping our code dry, which is one of the core principles of coding. If you've got to keep your code dry, you've got to don't repeat yourself. If it's in more than one place, there's chances for things to go wrong or inconsistencies. So we've got to come up with a name that matches both of them. So maybe we'd call it media card. Media card might work, but now we've got the problem of those two different things, those two components that do different things, even though they look very similar, now they're tied together forever. So if we want to style one of them separately from the rest, we have to add another class to the HTML, and that's blasphemy. We're not meant to be editing the markup. We're meant to be only touching the CSS. We want reusable HTML. So, they're now tied together. I like to think of it like this way. You can't create a new component without creating new HTML. But you can create a new component without writing any new CSS, so why don't we do that? We've got the CSS already. Let's just only touch the HTML, and you'll find there's a lot less to worry about. CSS is kind of a bit like Lego. So say you've got this car, and it's a really cool car, it's a Ferrari, how nice is that? But also you've been tasked with building a bus. Bus is a bit like a car, it's got four wheels and people go inside it. So would you use that car as a starting point to make a bus? Would you like pull it apart and then make it longer and taller? It's going to be a monstrosity. Like you would just start from scratch. You just build it piece by piece. It's the same method. The smaller, it's the same sort of thing with CSS. The smaller the pieces are, the more reusable they are. The more specific a component is, the harder it is to reuse. So one of the other benefits is that it's a lot faster to work with. Even though we're writing it piece by piece, we're only working in the HTML, so we're not jumping back and forth between the CSS file and the HTML file and checking it in the browser and back and forth. We're just doing it in the HTML. We just keep adding classes until it looks like it's meant to. But obviously, utility CSS is not without its criticism. As with any new technology, there's lots of people who don't like any new things. They're warranted to be fearful of trying new things. But hopefully I can sort of show you why most of it's unwarranted. The main one is the markup is really ugly. If you've got 1,000 classes on one element, or 20 or so classes, it kind of muddies up the code a little bit. It can look pretty ugly, but it's also, in my mind, one of the best features. Because at a glance, you can easily tell what CSS properties that element has on it. So I don't need to jump back and forth going, oh, was that display block or is it display flex? I don't really know. Why is it inheriting this weird CSS color anymore? Like, I can see it all right there on the HTML. I don't need to jump back and forth. So even though it kind of is ugly, it's really user-friendly. Another one I hear a lot is that you may as well use inline styles. So you're displaying how everything should look right there in the HTML. That's the same as inline styles. You do that in the HTML as well. But kind of, but not really. There's a couple of really prominent people in the CSS community have really come out against utility CSS. So, maybe I'm wrong. These guys are pretty smart guys. Dave Shea is the guy who created Css Zen Garden. But utility CSS, we've got reusable CSS because we define the styles and everything up front in the CSS. It's already there, so we don't have to redefine it every single time because you can't do that with an inline style. It's cacheable because it's in a separate CSS file. We can serve that same CSS file for every page of the website. It's already in the cache, so we're going to get better performance. You've got a built-in design system because you're choosing from a limited palette of choices. If we're going to use padding or margin or colors to pick from, we can only pick from a certain number of colors. So our designs are going to be a lot more consistent. We're not going to choose 13 pixel font here and 12 pixels here, and we have to choose what we're given. And there's a ton of extra features that you get in CSS that you can't do in inline styles. There's media queries. You can't do that with inline styles. pseudo states, so hover and active and selected and that sort of stuff. There's before and after and first and last. CSS animations. There's app supports. There's a ton of different things that you just can't do in inline styles. So it's different and probably better in all these ways. And the markup is still less. If I'm trying to center something both horizontally and vertically, I've got 3 classes I need to add in Tailwind. It's flex, justify center, item center. Whereas if I was to do that with inline styles, style equals display, flex, there's a lot more markup there. And the more styles you add, the more that compounds. Another thing is that people say your code's not dry. You keep repeating yourself. You're writing all these classes over and over and over again. And that is a real problem. But maybe stop and think. You might be surprised how little things are going to get reused. So if you're not going to reuse it, then there's no need to componentize or abstract that to something smaller. Just write the CSS right there in the HTML. And if you need to, you can go back and refactor later, but you're fine. You probably don't actually need to do that. But how are we going to keep the code dry for stuff that we're taking around everywhere, like a button that gets reused on most pages, or a card, or something that gets used a lot? So thankfully, we've got a lot of technologies today as web developers to try to do this. So I typically work in React. So React have components, as does Angular and Vue and other JavaScript libraries. You've got Blade with Laravel, there's Liquid, Handlebar, Mustache, Nunjuck templates. Tons of tools have these sort of things that you can use. So this is an example of how I would create that Zoidberg card from before with React. And I've got all the CSS that's where I need it to be, and I can just add props for the values that change, and that's it. It's pretty simple. Yes?
You've got a single CSS file.
Yes.
Storing all the Tailwind CSS?
Yes. Yep. Yep. I'll get to that a bit further on as well. So if you can't use those tools, because a lot of people don't have direct access to the built-in to their sort of pipeline of how everything's sort of tied together, it can get a bit messy sometimes. Tailwind has a built-in Apply Directive that you can use. So, and this is how it works. It goes off automatically. Press OK to keep your device on. Where would I find the OK? Well,
press all the buttons.
Yeah. Send to all. Let's put it back on. We'll see. All right. So this is how add-apply works. So we're going to define a class and say it's a button. Hopefully you can sort of see that. It might be easier on the screens. With the contrast is a little bit better. And then we can use apply to just pull in other classes that already exist. That one turned off, did it? Oh, okay. So we can set the font weight, the padding, the rounded, and then maybe we want to have a button that's blue. So this would be kind of like using the Bennett methodology, the modifier class. So your button's not necessarily always blue, so we have the button and the button blue. So we're going to set the background to be blue for these ones with the text that's white, and then we also want, when we hover over it, we want it to be maybe a darker shade of blue. And so this is what it would spit out at the end of the day, which means you don't need to manually write out all these things and carry those magic numbers around with you. And if we were to change the shade of blue that we're using in our projects, Tailwind take care of that for us. We don't have to keep writing that hex code over and over again. Yeah. So that apply is a post CSS directive. Yeah. So yeah, you can only use that if you're using it as a post CSS plugin. If you're using the CDN, that stuff's not going to work, unfortunately. So another problem that you run into is if everything's a class, you're going to end up with a hell of a lot of classes. By default, Tailwind ships with 54,311 lines of CSS, which is 875 kilobytes, almost a megabyte. That's crazy. That's a lot. But obviously there's things we can do. First of all, you should minify your CSS. So minifying is just removing any unneeded characters like spaces and carriage returns, that sort of thing. And that takes a good chunk of it. Now it's 549 kilobytes, but that's still way too much CSS for a website. So we would use server-side compression. So most servers gzip the CSS for you. So if we use gzip on a default install, that 875 now becomes 75. So that's a big saving. If you're lucky enough to have a server that has Brotli installed, it's down to 21 kilobytes. Maybe you don't actually need to do anything. You can just ship that and we're done with it. 5 minutes? Okay. But obviously we want to get that down as low as possible. So we've got a config file for Tailwind. So if we want to, we can remove all the colors that we're not using and the breakpoints that we're not using, and we can get that number down by a lot. So by default, Tailwind comes with, I think it's 93 colors from the palette, and then you've got text color, you've got border color, you've got background color, so it multiplies by a lot. And then you've got text, so it might be pink, text pink 100, and then on small breakpoints, text pink 100, and then medium breakpoints, so it multiplies on different breakpoints as well. So if you can get rid of colors and breakpoints and things that get used a lot, you can cut down that number by a fair bit. So for most people, that's probably fine. That's all you need to do. But we can go even better. The nuclear option, we can use something like Purge Css, which is going to remove any class that's not used. And this is what I use on my projects, and I think I average about 4 kilobytes of CSS, which is nothing. So the way Purge Css works is it's another post CSS plugin, and it looks at the markup that you've got there and compares it to the CSS that you've got and checks the both of them, and if the CSS class doesn't appear anywhere in the markup, it deletes it. So it's dead simple. So really the only thing that can go wrong is if you're doing funny things like concatenating strings together in JavaScript. So maybe you've got like a ternary operator that says, in this case, the text should be red because it's dangerous. And you're concatenating, you're adding the red instead of text red. So if you're clever about how you write the JavaScript, then this problem is not an issue. So yeah, that's how I use it. And JavaScript is the CSS file at the end of the day is tiny. Sorry?
I think you can tell for seconds. You get it for seconds.
Yeah, exactly. So you can whitelist things as well. So I had a website that I worked on recently where I actually did have to concatenate strings because there was a primary color that changed on different pages, for example. And there wasn't really a way to do that without writing a whole new page. So I just whitelisted the colors that we used, and it was like 12 classes I had to whitelist, and then it wasn't a problem. So yeah, final thoughts. So you don't have to name classes anymore. You don't have a massively growing code base of CSS. Generally, they tend to flatten off over time or go down when you're using utility CSS. There's no more unexpected consequences when you're changing your CSS. So you've got a lot more confidence that you know what you're doing. You can make changes. It's not going to break things. So I think it's worth your time. Even if you just give it a shot, use the CDN version, have a bit of a play with it. There's a couple of different websites. I think Tailwind.run's really cool. If you go to there, that's like a playground. You can just mess around and write your own HTML, and it'll show you. Can output everything for you. It's just a good way to get up and running and playing without having to set up Purge CSS and stuff if you don't want to. But yeah, if anyone has any more questions, feel free to talk to me anytime during the course of the next couple of days, or you can reach out to me on Twitter, Luke_Bennett_, or if you want to see any of the projects I've worked on, that's series or open source on my GitHub, which is LukeBennett88. And yeah, thanks for coming and listening to me yammer on.
Well, we've got some time for some questions. Has anyone got some questions for Luke? I'll do you because you're close by.
Thanks, Luke. That was a good talk. I like a lot of the concepts of utility for CSS. But one question I have is if everything's broken down like effectively into styles,
Yep.
do you end up with some elements that pretty much just have class spaghetti and it pretty much becomes unusable because there's that many classes on it?
You do end up with a lot of classes, but generally, like I'll normally, there's a couple of different methodologies on how you should write the classes. I normally just put them in alphabetical order so I can easily pass what they should be. And generally the different values will be prefixed, so if it's going to be a different colour, the colour's at the end or the start, so if I'm looking at the background I know to go towards the start. But yeah, I don't find it to be a problem.
Okay.
You don't get probably more than maybe 20 at the most, so it's pretty passable.
Any other questions? Over here.
Thanks. So you said before about using like Bootstrap and such, where you've got it's not Bootstrap, when you're building the custom classes in CSS based on what they are,
Yep.
and then you're reducing down your Tailwind multiple classes into a custom class. How do you avoid the same problem with Tailwind when you reduce down your custom collections of classes?
Yeah, so I tend to avoid using that Apply Directive as much as possible. So again, I mostly work in React, so I'll create a React component where I can. At Apply, I feel it's like it's an escape hatch. Like if you need to write something, you don't want to be writing a CSS for that button every single time. So it makes sense to use it just for things that, so you only sort of have 2 or 3 things at the most that you probably would use it for. Otherwise, yeah, it can get out of control pretty quickly. And you've got CSS in different places to look for now too, because typically you just look in the markup, you look in the HTML and you go, button, oh, what does button do? Does that have it block? Is it a flex item? Is it a, what color background does it have? You don't know. Then you've got to look at your CSS file as well. So the less places you have to look for stuff, the easier it is to debug problems.
Hey, I was just wondering if you could go back to the BEM example that you had.
Yep.
The bit that shows the code of
Yep.
the header and nav.
Yep. We've got a lot of slides.
So this naming convention thing is quite new to me.
Yes.
In the UL,
Yep.
the header nav has only 1 hyphen. Is that a mistake or is?
Mistake, yes.
Okay, cool. Great. Good. Yeah, because I was just trying to
Yeah.
understand the naming
Yeah,
decisions.
So yeah, the double
Yeah.
hyphens is just so you can have hyphenated words, and
Yeah.
it's obvious what's a block and what's the different parts of it.
Perfect. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Anyone else have questions just now? Oh, one more.
I've got one that's not directly related, but one I've always wanted to know about.
Yep.
How good, in semantic terms, was the HTML that they really originally created for CSS Garden?
Excellent. Yeah, it's great. I mean, I wasn't there from day dot, so I'm not sure if they modified it. I've had a look at the source when I was writing this, and there's a bunch of extra divs, blank divs that don't have anything on them with classes, which is not good semantic HTML. You shouldn't have elements that, especially for accessibility purposes and stuff, you shouldn't have elements in your HTML that are only there for styling. And it's even a big code block comment saying, don't use these anymore. We've got pseudo selectors like before and after and stuff. If you need to add extra stuff on there, we've got enough hooks that you shouldn't need to use that stuff. But apart from that, it's very well written HTML. So yeah, it is good semantic HTML.
Have a look at it.
Anyone else? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Luke. That was a great talk. Tailwind isn't something that I've looked at recently, so I'll definitely give it a go after your presentation. So give a big hand of applause to Luke. Thanks.
Thank you.